What's the most disastrous or shocking thing you've ever witnessed at a wedding? Story 1. I attended my cousin's wedding last year, and it was honestly one of the most bizarre experiences I've ever had. The ceremony was beautiful, but the reception, well, that's a different story. About 30 minutes after everyone started eating dinner, the groom's ex-girlfriend, who was not invited, showed up. No one was sure how she managed to get in, but she walked straight to the groom and confronted him in front of everyone. She was visibly upset and started shouting at him about how he couldn't just replace her and how they were supposed to get married. It was incredibly uncomfortable for everyone, especially since she knew almost all the family members. Things escalated when the bride tried to intervene. The ex-girlfriend shoved her, and a full-on catfight broke out. The groom tried to break them apart, but it wasn't working. Security finally stepped in, and the ex-girlfriend was escorted out, but not before throwing a glass of wine in the bride's face. The rest of the night was awkward, and the mood was completely ruined. I don't know how the couple managed to get through the night, but I guess it's a wedding they'll never forget. I don't think anyone will either. Story 2. I was at my friend's wedding in the Bahamas, and everything was going great, until the best man gave his speech. He had a long history with the groom, and as soon as he grabbed the mic, I knew it was going to be interesting. He started talking about their college days and the wild nights they had together. But then he went too far, pulling out photos of the groom passed out drunk at a party, wearing only a bath towel. The bride's face went pale and her friends started exchanging awkward glances. But it didn't stop there. The best man then dropped a bombshell. He revealed that the groom had a serious one-night stand a week before the wedding. The whole room went silent. The bride looked like she was going to faint, and the groom turned bright red. The best man realized his mistake too late and tried to apologize, but it was obvious the damage was done. The bride left the reception early, and I don't know if they ever fully recovered from it. It was one of the most uncomfortable moments I've ever witnessed. It wasn't a disaster in the traditional sense, but it definitely shocked everyone there. Story 3. This was a wedding I'll never forget. My friend's sister was getting married, and the whole family was excited. The ceremony itself went smoothly, but when it came time for the vows, something very unexpected happened. The bride was reciting her vows when she suddenly stopped, looking at the groom with a confused expression. She asked, "Is that your phone vibrating in your pocket?" The groom's face went from calm to absolutely terrified. He took his phone out and showed it to her. It was a text from someone named Jenny that read, "Can't wait to see you later tonight." Everyone at the ceremony went silent. The bride immediately asked him, "Who is Jenny?" The groom stuttered, but it was clear he had been caught. The bride turned and walked out of the ceremony, and there was this awkward tension that followed. I could see the groom trying to chase after her, but it was too late. It was honestly so awkward. No one knew what to do. The groom's family looked embarrassed, and the bride's family looked furious. That's how the wedding ended. I later found out they tried to salvage the reception, but the damage was done. No one wanted to stick around after the public humiliation. Story 4. It wasn't a wedding I attended, but it was a wedding I witnessed during my time as a wedding photographer. And let me tell you, it was a disaster. The couple was beautiful, and everything seemed perfect up until the moment they exchanged rings. As the groom slipped the ring on the bride's finger, he said, "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." But just as he finished the sentence, he turned and whispered something to his best man. That was when the bride's mother noticed, and she lost it. She started screaming at the groom, accusing him of cheating with the best man's wife. The groom was stunned and tried to deny it, but the mother wasn't having it. She started calling for security, and the bride just stood there, crying uncontrollably. It became a full-on scene. Family members yelling at each other, people running around trying to calm everyone down. The worst part? The groom's ex-wife showed up mid-scene and started taunting him. She apparently still had feelings for him and tried to win him back in front of everyone. That wedding was over before it even began. The bride called it off right there and everyone just left. It's still a topic of conversation among my photographer friends because of how completely off the rails it went. Story 5. I'll never forget the wedding of two people who had been planning it for months. It was a grand affair, complete with a huge reception, thousands of dollars spent on food, and an expensive venue. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the best man's toast. Instead of the usual funny and heartwarming speech, he started revealing deep personal details about the groom. He told stories about how the groom had been unfaithful to his first wife, and how he always hooked up with bridesmaids at other weddings. Everyone was in shock, especially the bride, who had no idea this was coming. The room was dead silent. The bride started crying, and the groom was frantically trying to stop the best man. But the best man wouldn't stop. He even claimed that the groom had flirted with his own sister, and it was clear this wasn't going to end well. The bride ran out of the room, and the groom chased after her. The wedding was called off that night, and it was honestly a mess. People tried to salvage the situation, but no one could forget what had just happened. It was a full-on public humiliation, and no one expected the best man to ruin the whole event. Story 6. My cousin's wedding was something out of a sitcom. The ceremony was beautiful, and everything was going smoothly until the reception. The bride had arranged a big surprise for the groom, a custom song sung by her and her bridesmaids. It was a touching gesture, or at least it was supposed to be. As they started singing, the groom's mother, who had been seated at the back, suddenly stood up and yelled, "You think this is the wedding song you deserve?" The entire room froze, and the bride, mid-song, looked completely lost. Apparently, the groom's mom had never approved of the bride. But it didn't end there. She stormed toward the stage and began loudly listing all the reasons why she thought her son was making a huge mistake, marrying the bride. To make things worse, she started throwing bread rolls at the bride's parents, calling them low class and unfit for her son. The groom stood there trying to calm his mom down, but she wasn't having it. The bride, in shock, began crying. It took every ounce of self-control for the bride's father to not launch into a shouting match with her. Eventually, the groom's mother was escorted out by security. It was one of those moments where everyone was unsure whether to comfort the bride or laugh nervously. The wedding carried on, but the damage was done. The bride and groom tried to salvage the night, but that scene lingered in everyone's minds. It's one of the most awkward and shocking things I've ever witnessed at a wedding. Story 7. I've been to some odd weddings, but nothing like this. My best friend from college got married, and the entire wedding was themed around a vintage romantic vibe. Old-school love letters, antique decor, and everything straight out of a fairy tale. It was perfect, until the cake cutting. The bride, who had been nothing but charming up until then, got a strange look in her eyes as the groom reached for the cake knife. Suddenly, she turned to the crowd, raised her hand and shouted, "I can't do this! I can't marry him!" Everyone froze. The groom looked absolutely shocked, not knowing how to react. The bride, holding her breath, turned to the groom and, in front of hundreds of guests, accused him of cheating. Apparently, she had caught him texting another woman just days before the wedding. She said that she had gone through his phone and saw messages that confirmed he was planning to leave her after the wedding. The groom stood there in disbelief, trying to explain, but the bride wouldn't hear it. She stormed off and the entire reception turned into chaos. The guests were all talking over each other, unsure of what was happening. A few of her friends attempted to calm her down, but she was already on her way out. The groom was left standing in front of a half-eaten wedding cake and a crowd of confused guests. It took a couple of weeks for anyone to figure out what really happened, but the groom never got a chance to explain himself. The wedding was completely called off. Story 8. My cousin was getting married in a beautiful little chapel on the coast, and it was all so picturesque. A small, intimate ceremony with only close family and friends. But when it came time for the vows, everything went off track. The groom had a history of joking around, and we all knew he loved to tell funny stories. But when it was his turn to speak, he decided to joke about how he wasn't actually sure he was ready for marriage. He said, "Well, I've been thinking about this, and honestly, I don't think I'm the type to settle down." The bride was visibly shocked, but he continued on with some lighthearted comments about how he wasn't prepared for the responsibility. At first, everyone chuckled nervously, unsure if he was being serious or just trying to make light of the situation. But it quickly became apparent that he wasn't joking at all. The bride stood up, tears in her eyes, and told him to stop. She asked him, "Are you really questioning this in front of everyone right now? At our wedding?" The groom, realizing what a mess he'd made, tried to apologize, but the bride was having none of it. She walked out of the chapel, leaving the groom standing there, completely dumbfounded. The worst part? The groom tried to convince her to come back, but she refused. Her family left with her, and the wedding was called off right then and there. The groom's family awkwardly stayed behind, and most guests quickly left too, leaving the entire venue silent and awkward. The reception was canceled, and it took a while for anyone to recover from the shock of that public meltdown. Story 9. This one is a bit hard to believe, but I promise it's true. A friend of mine invited me to her wedding, and I knew she had a complicated relationship with her father. They hadn't spoken much in the past few years, but I assumed she would have him walk her down the aisle like most brides do. But during the ceremony, as they stood at the altar, something completely unexpected happened. Right before the vows, the bride turned to her father and said, "I can't marry him. Not until you give me your blessing." She said it so calmly, but I could tell she was holding back tears. The father, clearly uncomfortable, told her that he wasn't sure if he could give her his blessing, considering their history. The groom standing there seemed completely confused. What happened next shocked everyone. Her father started to walk away from the ceremony, saying, "If I'm not good enough for you to stand by, then I'm not going to stand here for this wedding." The bride's face went white as he moved toward the door, and before anyone could stop him, he was gone. The bride hesitated for a few moments, looking torn. The groom, unsure of how to proceed, asked if they could go on without her father's blessing. But the bride, completely devastated, made the decision to call off the wedding. The ceremony was ended right then and there, and it was one of the most emotional and confusing things I've ever witnessed. Story 10. I went to a wedding recently that felt like a romantic comedy gone horribly wrong. Everything was perfect. The couple seemed so in love, the decorations were gorgeous, and the food was delicious. But then came the reception, and that's when things got very interesting. During the first dance, something unusual happened. The groom started acting a little strange. At first, we thought it was just nerves, but then he started giggling uncontrollably. He was obviously drunk, even though the wedding was just getting started. He began to slur his words and then made a bizarre confession to his bride. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I should have told you sooner. I don't want to be here." Everyone around the dance floor stopped moving, looking at each other in disbelief. The bride pulled back, her eyes welling up with tears, and tried to make him stop. But the groom, still giggling and stumbling, continued, "I don't know if I love you like I should. I think I might have made a huge mistake." The bride ran off the dance floor, and her maid of honor tried to comfort her, but the groom's behavior didn't stop. He started laughing louder and even started dancing around, completely unaware of how out of control he was. The reception ended early, and while I don't know what happened after, I do know that the wedding was over before it even had a chance to begin. Story 11. It was supposed to be a magical day. My best friend's wedding was just a dream. The ceremony was beautiful, and the reception was in a stunning rustic barn with fairy lights twinkling everywhere. Everyone was relaxed, enjoying themselves, and everything was going according to plan. Until the bouquet toss. The bride, in her elegant dress, tossed the bouquet high into the air. All the single women scrambled, hands reaching for it, laughing and cheering. But something unusual happened. One of the single ladies, a cousin of the groom, caught it easily. There was a round of applause and some playful teasing, but no one noticed how intense the bride's expression had gotten. A few moments after the toss, the bride walked over to the cousin with a forced smile. The cousin, who had been smiling and laughing, suddenly stiffened. Without warning, the bride slapped her across the face. The whole room went silent, unsure of what was going on. The bride, now in tears, screamed, "You've been sleeping with my fiancé, haven't you?" It took a moment for everything to sink in. The cousin, completely stunned, started to deny the accusation, but the bride wasn't having it. Apparently, there had been a long-standing affair between her groom and her cousin, which she found out about only hours before the wedding. The cousin tried to run away, but security quickly stepped in. The bride was shaking, heartbroken, and completely humiliated. The groom tried to apologize, but the bride turned and left the reception. The entire room was left in chaos. Guests unsure whether to leave or stay, people whispering to each other, some awkwardly trying to comfort the cousin. The wedding was called off that night, and the bride never spoke to the groom again. It was one of the most shocking and gut-wrenching moments I've ever witnessed at a wedding. Story 12. I've been to many weddings, but this one stands out for all the wrong reasons. It was an upscale wedding, everything top-notch, from the catering to the breathtaking venue on the beach. But what was supposed to be a fairy tale ceremony quickly turned into a drama-filled spectacle. Right after the vows, the groom's father, who had been quiet during the ceremony, suddenly stood up and started walking toward the stage. No one knew what he was doing at first, but then he reached the couple and, in front of everyone, he handed the groom an envelope. The groom hesitated but opened it, and then his face went pale. The letter was an official letter from a lawyer, stating that the groom had unknowingly signed a prenuptial agreement years ago with his ex-wife. Turns out, his father had orchestrated the entire thing, forcing him into the prenup with the ex-wife to protect the family fortune. The bride looked as confused as the rest of us, trying to understand what was happening. The groom turned to her, apologizing, but it was clear the shock had taken its toll on the bride's emotions. She stood there, furious, and demanded answers. The groom tried to explain that he didn't remember signing it, but the bride didn't buy it. She yelled at him, accusing him of not being honest with her, and walked out of the ceremony. The groom's father, still standing on stage, seemed indifferent, not even offering a word of comfort. The bride's family immediately left, and the reception was canceled. A lot of people tried to salvage the evening, but the atmosphere was completely ruined. The groom's family later claimed it was all for the best, but the bride and groom never ended up together. Story 13. I'll never forget the wedding of my childhood friend. It was one of those lavish affairs with hundreds of guests, and everything was picture perfect. The ceremony went smoothly, and everyone was looking forward to the reception. But then, during the first dance between the bride and groom, things started to take a bizarre turn. The groom, who had always been a bit of a jokester, began to perform an awkward dance move. He started to sway and spin in a way that made everyone chuckle at first. But then, As he twirled the bride, he lost his balance and fell right into the giant wedding cake. What followed was chaos. Cake splattered all over the groom's tuxedo and the bride's dress. The entire cake, an impressive three-tiered confection, was now smashed, and people in the crowd were unsure whether to laugh or cry. The bride stood there in shock as the groom tried to laugh it off. He was covered in frosting and fondant, and the bride, looking devastated, started to tear up. But then the real bombshell dropped. The bride's mother, who had been watching the whole thing in silence, suddenly shouted at the groom, accusing him of ruining her daughter's big day. She marched toward him, scolding him for being irresponsible and embarrassing her daughter in front of all these people. The groom, still covered in cake, tried to apologize, but it was clear things were spiraling out of control. The wedding party quickly became uncomfortable as the bride's mother began tearing into the groom, claiming he wasn't good enough for her daughter. The bride, trying to hold back tears, fled the reception, leaving her new husband standing. The groom followed after her, but the damage was done. The wedding was unofficially canceled, and the reception turned into an awkward mess. Story 14. This one happened a few years ago, and I can still hardly believe it. A friend of mine was getting married at a beautiful vineyard, with the ceremony taking place outdoors. It was a sunny afternoon and everything was going perfectly, until the bride's father gave his speech. The father of the bride started off with a touching story about his daughter growing up, but then he began to speak a little too candidly. As he told the crowd how proud he was of his daughter, he also mentioned some rather personal details, including how, in the past, his daughter had been involved with several of her ex-boyfriends, while she was already in relationships with other men. He joked about how she had a reputation for being a bit of a heartbreaker. The entire room went silent. Guests looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or feel uncomfortable. The bride, standing next to her fiancé, turned bright red. She tried to calm her father down, but he just kept going, making more embarrassing comments about her love life. The groom, clearly upset, pulled his bride aside to talk. The bride, clearly upset, tried to keep her composure, but after a few more minutes of uncomfortable silence, she walked out. It was clear that her father's speech had deeply hurt her, and she couldn't bear to stay in the spotlight any longer. The groom tried to comfort her, but the wedding was effectively over. The reception turned into a series of awkward conversations, and people started leaving one by one. By the end of the night, the bride and groom had decided to call off the wedding. Story 15. A few years ago, I attended a wedding where everything seemed normal, until the reception. The couple was in love, and their vows were touching. The entire wedding was picture perfect, until a former lover of the groom showed up. She wasn't invited, but no one knew how she got past security. She walked up to the groom during the toast and, in front of everyone, yelled, "We're not done yet!" The entire room froze as the groom's face turned pale. He quickly tried to reassure his bride, but the ex wouldn't stop. Apparently, the groom and his ex had been on and off for years, and she had never really gotten over him. She began confronting the bride, shouting, "He promised me we'd be together forever." She even went as far as showing a video of her and the groom from an intimate moment they shared just weeks before the wedding. The bride, stunned, demanded answers from the groom, who was caught completely off guard. The groom tried to calm everyone down, but the situation only escalated, and the wedding guests were forced to intervene. The bride ended up running out of the reception, and the groom followed her, leaving the rest of the guests in complete shock. That night, the wedding was canceled. The groom later apologized profusely, but the bride couldn't bring herself to trust him again, and they ended their relationship. It was the most shocking and heartbreaking wedding incident I've ever witnessed. Story 16. A friend of mine had the most incredible wedding planned. Everything was in place. The ceremony was set on a secluded hill overlooking a lake, with breathtaking views, and everything looked perfect. The guests were arriving in shuttles, and the bride was absolutely glowing. But something unexpected happened that completely derailed the day. As the ceremony began, the groom was waiting eagerly at the altar. However, as the bride walked down the aisle, a loud crash interrupted the moment. A drone, which was intended to capture aerial photos of the ceremony, malfunctioned and spiraled out of control. It collided mid-air with one of the floral arrangements, sending both the drone and the flowers tumbling to the ground. The drone landed right on the groom's head, knocking his glasses off and leaving him dazed and confused. While the guests were stunned, the groom had a moment of clarity and, laughing off the incident, tried to make a joke. But as he bent down to pick up his glasses, he accidentally tripped over the train of the bride's dress. The bride stumbled, and the whole procession came to a halt as she fell into the flower, knocking her over as well. The entire crowd gasped in unison. But the worst part? The bride's mother, who was sitting in the front row, yelled out, "This is a sign! It's a disaster!" Everyone looked at her in shock, unsure if she was serious. The bride stood up, her makeup now a bit smeared, and looked embarrassed, but she insisted they continue with the ceremony. Despite the odd mishaps, they managed to finish the ceremony, but the reception was filled with whispers, and no one could stop talking about the drone disaster. It was a funny story to look back on, but no one would forget how chaotic that wedding truly was. Story 17. A colleague of mine got married last summer at a lavish private estate. Everything was stunning. The venue, the food, the decor. It was a real fairy tale. But during the ceremony, just as the bride and groom exchanged vows, the unexpected happened. The groom's ex-wife, who had been invited to the wedding as a friendly gesture, as his new bride had insisted, stood up in the middle of their vows and yelled, "This is a huge mistake and you know it." The bride, completely shocked, froze in place. The groom looked like he had seen a ghost, and the whole ceremony halted for several awkward seconds. The ex-wife, who was sitting near the front, stood up and went on to explain in detail how she still loved him and how he was making the biggest mistake of his life. She then dramatically walked toward the altar, grabbed the groom by the arm, and tried to pull him away from the bride. The crowd was in absolute chaos, some people trying to comfort the bride, while others awkwardly glanced at the groom, who seemed utterly paralyzed by the situation. The bride, now in tears, told the ex-wife to leave. Security had to escort her out of the venue, but before she left, she threw a final parting shot. "You can't replace me with this child," referring to the bride. It was heartbreaking for the bride, and after some time she composed herself and insisted the ceremony continue, but the mood had undeniably shifted. The reception followed, but the tension was thick. The groom spent the rest of the evening apologizing profusely, but it was clear the bride was forever scarred by the public humiliation. Story 18. This wedding, which took place in a small town, started out like any other. The ceremony was small but beautiful. Family and close friends gathered at a quaint church. But everything changed when the bride walked down the aisle. At the altar, the groom had a strange look on his face. He didn't seem nervous, but instead, he seemed a bit distant. As the bride began to recite her vows, he suddenly cut her off. He blurted out, "I'm sorry, but I can't do this." The bride froze in place, and the guests, not understanding what was happening, began murmuring to each other. The groom, with tears in his eyes, admitted that he had recently reconnected with a former lover. He told the bride that he couldn't marry her because he had fallen back in love with someone else. The entire room was silent. The bride, shaking, tried to hold back her tears, but it was clear that she was devastated. She turned to walk away, but the groom reached out and grabbed her arm, asking her to stay. She yanked her arm away, looked him in the eyes and said, "You just ruined my life." She then walked out, leaving the guests in complete shock. The groom, not knowing what to do, stood at the altar as the wedding was called off right there. The reception was immediately canceled, and while most of the guests stayed, no one could really bring themselves to speak. It was one of the most awkward and painful moments I've ever witnessed at a wedding. Story 19. I was at a wedding last year, and everything seemed to be going well. The couple was in love, the venue was elegant, and the ceremony was beautiful. But right after the vows were exchanged, the best man stood up to give his speech, and that's when things went horribly wrong. The best man, a lifelong friend of the groom, started off with a couple of funny anecdotes. But then, in an unexpected twist, he began to reveal more than anyone bargained for. He shared stories of how the groom had been unfaithful in the past, things that the bride didn't know and most of the guests had no idea about. The best man even talked about the groom's previous relationships in a way that made it clear he was still harboring some unresolved feelings about his friend's past. The bride, who had been smiling and enjoying the speech up until that point, suddenly turned pale. Her face twisted with confusion and anger as she looked at the groom. The best man continued to speak, seemingly unaware of the tension building in the room. When he started recounting the groom's wild bachelor party stories, the bride got up from her seat and demanded to know what was going on. The groom, now visibly sweating, tried to interrupt, but it was too late. The bride ran out of the reception hall, her family quickly following. The best man, realizing his mistake, apologized, but the damage was done. The groom chased after his bride, but she was already gone. The reception went from a celebration to an awkward, uncomfortable mess in seconds. The couple never ended up reconciling after that. It's still unclear whether the best man was simply trying to be funny or if there was some jealousy at play, but it certainly marked the end of their wedding day. Story 20. It was a sunny afternoon, and I had the pleasure of attending my friend's wedding at a beautiful garden venue. Everything about the day was magic. The flowers were in bloom, the sun was shining, and the guests were smiling. But the whole day took a dramatic turn during the reception. After the speeches and toasts, the couple decided to have a fun tradition where everyone danced and celebrated. But as the music played and the bride and groom were spinning around the dance floor, something unusual happened. The groom's former partner, who was not invited to the wedding, showed up unexpectedly. She stormed into the venue, yelling at the groom, accusing him of not being honest with her about their past. The bride, who had no idea the groom was still in touch with his ex, turned to him in shock. The groom tried to calm the situation, but his ex wasn't having it. She claimed the groom had promised to marry her years ago and had moved on too quickly after their breakup. She began to demand that the groom explain himself right there, in front of all the guests. The bride's face turned bright red with embarrassment, and she ran out of the venue, leaving the groom to handle the aftermath. The groom tried to chase after her, but security had to escort the ex out of the venue. The entire wedding party was left standing in silence, unsure what to do next. In the end, the couple's relationship was never the same after that day. Story 21. I attended a wedding that I'll never forget, but not for the reasons you might think. It started as a typical evening with everyone mingling and enjoying the gorgeous reception hall. The bride, who had always been a perfectionist, was glowing. The groom, on the other hand, seemed a little too nervous, but he was charming enough. Everything was on track until the speeches began. The best man got up to give his speech, and from the very start it was clear he had something up his sleeve. He started by reminiscing about all the good times he had with the groom, and shared some hilarious stories from their childhood. But then, things took a strange turn. He began mentioning how the groom had always been a bit of a player in his younger days, and how he'd had some very colorful relationships before settling down. The bride's face immediately changed. She went from smiling to looking like she'd just swallowed something sour. As the best man continued to reminisce about the groom's adventures, the bride turned to the groom, visibly upset. The best man, oblivious to the shift in mood, mentioned that the groom had once had a brief fling with one of the bridesmaids, who was sitting just a few feet away. The bridesmaid, who had been quiet up until that point, stood up abruptly and stormed out of the reception hall, leaving the bride staring after her in disbelief. The groom immediately rushed after her, trying to explain, but it was too late. The bride, now furious and visibly shaking, grabbed the microphone and said, "If you can't even keep things together on our wedding day, then I don't know what we're doing here." The entire reception became incredibly awkward. The best man, realizing what he'd done, tried to apologize, but the damage had already been done. The bride and groom had a heated argument right there, with some of the guests trying to intervene. Ultimately, the bride left the venue, and the groom followed after her, leaving the rest of the guests in stunned silence. The wedding was canceled that evening, and the bride never spoke to the groom again. It was the most uncomfortable and shocking thing I've ever witnessed at a wedding. Story 22. I'll never forget a wedding I attended a few years ago. It was supposed to be a small, intimate event at a lovely countryside inn. The bride was elegant, and the groom was the picture of a happy man, looking as though his dreams were coming true. But the moment they exchanged their vows, things took a turn for the worst. Right after they said, "I do," the groom turned to the bride with a big smile and gave her a kiss. It was a beautiful moment, but then, out of nowhere, the groom's phone rang. He glanced at it quickly, and his entire expression changed. He excused himself from the bride, took the phone call, and walked off to the side. The bride, clearly confused and a little hurt, tried to smile, but the awkwardness was palpable. The groom was on the phone for what felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, the guests began whispering to each other, unsure of what was going on. When the groom returned, he didn't seem to have the same joy he had earlier. In fact, he seemed shaken, like he'd just received some bad news. As the reception continued, the groom seemed increasingly distracted. His phone kept buzzing with messages and calls, which he would answer quickly, sometimes stepping away from the bride for a few moments. Eventually, it became clear what was happening. He was receiving texts from his ex-girlfriend. And not just any texts. Flirty, emotional texts about how much she missed him and wanted him back. The bride, after noticing this, confronted the groom, and a huge argument broke out in front of everyone. The guests were in shock as the groom tried to explain that it wasn't a big deal, but the bride wasn't having it. She threw her bouquet on the ground and said, "If you can't even respect me today, then we're done." The wedding ended there, and the couple left the venue separately. The reception was canceled, and it was clear that the groom's past was too big a burden for their marriage to overcome. The bride eventually filed for divorce, and the whole situation felt like one of those bizarre, painful scenes you never expect to see on a wedding day. Story 23. My cousin had the most extravagant wedding planned. It was going to be an unforgettable event, and she was beyond excited to marry the love of her life. The ceremony took place in a beautiful garden, and everything was picturesque. But things went south the moment the groom's family showed up. Now, the groom's family had always been a bit eccentric, to put it mildly. They were known for being loud and opinionated, and they had a long history of causing drama. But no one could have predicted what would happen during the reception. As the couple made their way into the reception hall, the groom's mother stood up and started clapping loudly, as though it was some sort of performance. Everyone awkwardly looked around. unsure of what was going on. But the real shock came when she started making her way to the dance floor. She grabbed the groom by the arm, pulled him away from the bride, and announced to everyone, "This wedding should never have happened. I never approved of her." She then went on to list all the reasons she thought the bride was unfit for her son. It wasn't just a mild disagreement, it was a full-on rant. She said things like, "She's not good enough for him," and "She's only marrying you for the money." The groom, mortified, tried to pull his mother away, but she kept going, calling the bride's family low class and accusing them of only marrying her son for his wealth. The bride's family, shocked and hurt, stood up to defend her, but things quickly escalated into a shouting match. Guests began leaving, some whispering that the wedding had turned into a family circus. The bride, heartbroken, took her wedding dress off early, and the couple left together. But it was clear that this wedding would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The groom later apologized profusely, but his relationship with his mother was never the same, and the bride and groom ended up separating a year later. Story 24. This wedding was one of the most shocking experiences I've had. It started like any other. Beautiful venue, gorgeous couple, lovely decorations. But during the vows, things got tense. The bride, who had been nothing but happy throughout the ceremony, suddenly turned pale and stopped speaking in the middle of her vows. The groom, looking concerned, asked if everything was okay. The bride responded, "No, it's not." She then turned to the crowd and said, "I can't marry him. I thought I could, but I can't." Everyone in the audience was speechless, unsure if this was part of some elaborate joke or if something was wrong. The groom, stunned, just stood there. The bride, in tears, explained that she had been struggling with feelings of doubt for a while, and she didn't want to make a commitment she wasn't sure about. The groom, trying to hold back his own tears, asked if they could just finish the ceremony and work through it. But the bride shook her head and said, "No, I can't. It wouldn't be fair to either of us." It was incredibly awkward as guests started shuffling around. Some tried to comfort the bride, while others attempted to calm the groom. The bride walked out of the ceremony, and the groom tried to follow, but she left the venue. The wedding was called off right then and there, and the reception, which had already been set up, was canceled. It turned out that the bride had been feeling uncertain for months, but it wasn't until the actual wedding day that she realized she couldn't go through with it. She and the groom later ended up parting ways, but it was one of the most emotionally intense wedding moments I've ever witnessed. Story 25. A wedding I attended recently went from cheerful to completely chaotic in a matter of minutes. The ceremony was beautiful, and the couple looked in love as they exchanged their vows. Everything seemed perfect, but it all fell apart during the reception. The bride and groom had arranged a special dance for their first dance, and everyone gathered to watch. But just as they started, the groom's ex-girlfriend, who had been invited as a friend, stood up and started yelling. She shouted that the groom was still in love with her, and that he was only marrying the bride because he felt guilty about leaving her for someone else. The guests were in shock as the ex-girlfriend charged toward the dance floor, pulling the groom away from the bride. The bride, visibly upset, stepped back, her eyes welling up with tears. The groom, trying to calm the situation, kept saying, "This isn't what you think." But the ex wasn't listening. The bride, unable to take it anymore, demanded that the ex leave the wedding. Security was called, and the ex was escorted out. The entire reception was thrown into disarray as the bride and groom tried to salvage the evening. The bride went to her family for comfort, but the groom was left to apologize to everyone. Ultimately, the wedding carried on, but it was clear that no one would forget the spectacle. The tension never fully dissipated, and while the couple stayed together, their relationship was never the same after that chaotic event. Story 26. I attended a wedding a few months ago that, honestly, still leaves me scratching my head. It was a cozy ceremony in a beautiful chapel. The bride looked stunning, and the groom had this look of pure love on his face. Everything was moving along perfectly until it was time for the vows. The couple stood hand in hand, ready to say their promises to each other in front of friends and family. The groom went first, reciting a heartfelt vow that had everyone in the room tearing up. But when it was the bride's turn, she seemed to hesitate for a moment. Then, instead of reciting the vows she'd written, she started addressing the groom's best man. "I know you think this is funny, but I'm not going through with this," she said, her voice trembling. The groom looked confused, and so did everyone else. The bride turned to the best man, saying, "You've been more than just my friend, and you know it." The best man, who had been standing with his jaw on the floor, finally spoke up, his face turning bright red. He mumbled, "I don't know what." But the bride wasn't stopping. She continued, "I'm in love with him, not you." She turned toward the groom and said, "I can't marry you. I was going to go through with it, but I can't anymore." The groom stood there, frozen. The whole chapel went quiet. People were unsure whether to laugh, cry, or just leave. The bride's family was in utter disbelief, while the groom's family was speechless too. The bride and best man left together, with the groom standing there holding the ring. The ceremony ended right then and there, with no one knowing what had just happened. The best man and the bride stayed together for a while afterward, but the groom was left heartbroken. That day remains one of the most shocking wedding experiences I've ever had. Story 27. I attended a wedding in a beautiful vineyard last summer, which was set up to be a perfect day. The venue was gorgeous, the weather was ideal, and the ceremony was running smooth. But what happened next was the last thing anyone could have anticipated. The bride and groom exchanged their vows, their love for each other evident to all who were there. But when the groom said, "I do," he didn't just stop there. He looked at the bride and without warning, he said, "But I have something to tell you." Before the bride could respond, the groom turned to the crowd and admitted, "I've been seeing someone else for the past 6 months." His voice was steady, but his face was full of regret. The bride gasped, as did everyone else, as the groom continued to explain that he had fallen in love with someone else and couldn't go through with the marriage. The bride was in complete shock, unable to speak at first. She turned to her maid of honor, who quickly rushed to comfort her. The guests were unsure whether this was a joke or if he was serious. But it wasn't a joke. The groom turned to the bride, apologized, and said, "I don't deserve you, and I can't do this to you." After a few tense moments, the bride whispered, "I guess we're done." She handed him the wedding ring, and without a word, she walked out of the ceremony, leaving the groom standing there, looking devastated. The reception was awkward at best. The bride's family and friends left shortly after, and the groom stayed behind, sitting alone at the head table. The wedding never really happened, and both sides of the family left in stunned silence. Story 28. This wedding disaster involves one of my oldest friends. She had spent months planning the perfect wedding. She'd been with her fiancé for years, and everything seemed to be in order, until the day of the ceremony. The venue was spectacular, and the guests were all seated, eagerly awaiting the bride. As she walked down the aisle, everyone looked at her in awe. But as she reached the altar, something strange happened. The groom fainted. At first, we thought it was just nerves, but when he hit the floor, it was clear something was wrong. People rushed to his side, trying to revive him, and the bride stood there, unsure of what to do. Eventually, an ambulance arrived, and the groom was carried away, leaving the bride standing at the altar in front of an entire congregation. Turns out, the groom had a medical condition he had kept hidden from the bride, something he had never shared with anyone. While he was in the hospital, the bride had to decide whether or not she wanted to go through with the wedding. She sat at the hospital, questioning everything, as her groom recovered from a panic attack that had triggered a fainting episode. At the end of the day, she decided not to call off the wedding, but they rescheduled the ceremony to a later date. The guests, confused and somewhat awkward, all went home, and the wedding was postponed. It wasn't the wedding anyone had imagined, but eventually, the couple did get married, albeit a few weeks later. It was a reminder that not everything goes as planned, but the important thing is to adapt and move forward. Story 29. I'll never forget this one wedding. It started off like any other, quiet, intimate ceremony with a handful of friends and family gathered at a lovely estate. The couple looked so happy, and everything was set for a beautiful day. However, during the reception, it quickly became clear that something was off. The groom's ex-wife, who was invited as a friendly gesture by the bride, started drinking more than anyone had anticipated. As the night went on, the ex-wife became louder and more agitated. She began making snide comments about the bride and groom, and soon, it became evident she wasn't handling her emotions well. The ex-wife eventually stood up during the speeches and started shouting. She accused the groom of lying to the bride, saying that he had promised her they would always be together and that he was just going through the motions with the new bride. She even accused him of cheating on her during their marriage. The entire room went quiet. The bride, looking stunned, turned to the groom, who was nervously trying to calm the ex-wife down. But it didn't work. The ex-wife stormed out of the reception shouting, "You're not even worth it," as she left. The rest of the evening was incredibly uncomfortable, with the groom trying to apologize to the bride, who was now very upset. They ended the night early, and it was clear that the ex-wife's presence had completely ruined the mood. The wedding was never the same for either of them after that night. Story 30. This one takes place at a high-profile wedding in the city. And let me tell you, it was straight out of a disaster. The bride was a socialite, and the groom was a successful businessman, so the whole thing was very glamorous. The wedding was packed with celebrities, journalists, and other high-profile guests. However, things went wrong right after the vows. The bride had arranged for a grand display of fireworks to celebrate the newlyweds, but something went horribly wrong. As the fireworks began to go off in the distance, there was a loud explosion, followed by another, and another. The guests turned toward the sky, horrified. The fireworks display had gone terribly wrong. One of the rockets veered off course and landed near the venue, causing a huge fire. Everyone rushed to evacuate, and the fire department had to rush to the scene. The bride and groom were hustled away by security, and the rest of the evening was spent watching as fire trucks surrounded the area. The wedding was completely ruined. Guests were scattered, and the groom had to call for a refund on the venue, as the whole place was damaged. The fireworks display was supposed to be a grand finale, but it ended up being the start of an unforgettable disaster. While no one was seriously injured, the couple never got their perfect wedding day. They later joked that they'd just eloped instead, but the memory of that explosion will forever linger in the minds of everyone who attended.